Throughout the 9 Steven Universe videos on my channel, there's one constant, being that I hardly ever mention the show's epilogue season, Steven Universe Future, and you can probably guess why. That's right, I'm a huge fan of the season and would probably go as far to say that it's my favorite season of a show that I hold in really high regard, and now that 3 years have passed and we're allowed to admit that it's good, I can finally come out as a future apologist. And while I initially was going to make a video about the entire season, I realized that if I were to make that video now, I would end up wanting to talk extensively about the 5 or 6 episodes that really stuck with me, more or less destroying the flow of that hypothetical video. So to remedy that problem, I've decided to talk about some of those episodes in a less broad context, so that if I ever do make that video, I can talk more about how each one fits into the season as a whole. Anyway, unnecessarily long story short, I'm going to be talking about some Steven Universe Future episodes non-consecutively on the channel for a few months, and what better episode to start with than Mr. Universe, one with a similar title to the last episode I covered on this channel, except whereas that episode is about Greg and Pearl and how their relationship was mended, Mr. Universe is about Greg and Steven and how their relationship was, albeit temporarily, destroyed. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. In this video, we're going to go through the episode, one of the last in the franchise, and discuss how, despite sometimes feeling like a different show, Mr. Universe still uses everything that Steven Universe perfected over its 7-year run to question one of its strongest relationships and craft one of its strongest gut punches. Mr. Universe picks up right where Growing Pains left off, with Greg having stepped away from Sadie's tour in order to help Steven after his traumatic doctor's visit. And accordingly, there's a feeling of guilt in Steven throughout the first part of this episode. This pops up fairly early, as after Greg very sweetly prepares Steven dessert for dinner, he asks him whether or not he's feeling alright, and instead of answering immediately, Steven pauses for a second. While he's obviously in less physical strife than he was when he was in the hospital, Steven is certainly not mentally alright, but really doesn't want to admit this to his father. Him not feeling comfortable telling things to Greg is something that was almost entirely absent in the first 5 seasons of the show, and it's a mini gut punch predecessor for what's to come. After some prodding from Greg, Steven does eventually admit what's bugging him.
I spent so long trying to figure out whether or not I was mom. Now that I actually know I'm me, it's like I have no idea who that is.
And it's after this kind of impressive self-diagnosis that this episode begins its really interesting characterization of Greg, as he attempts to relate his journey of exploring the world and finding his rockstar self to Steven needing to discover his identity outside of trying to save the Earth, ultimately suggesting that he take a road trip just like Greg did. The reason this part of the episode is so interesting in retrospect of the finale is despite the fact that Greg will make a series of poor parenting decisions in this episode, he ends up being right about what Steven needed as he ends this season going off to see the world. More on that later, but first we get a montage of Steven and his father going off to see the Earth outside of Beach City, backed by the song Dear Old Dad from Houseguest. The use of this song is another really interesting facet to the episode, especially given the reveal at the end of it that the pair are listening to a recorded version of it in Greg's van. Going back 138 episodes, the reason that this song is significant is because of the context around it in Houseguest, being that Greg is faking an injury to spend more time with his son so that they can hang out like they used to, something that ultimately temporarily causes Steven to lose his ability to heal. And besides the fact that this episode plays a song from the episode with the biggest Greg and Steven argument up to this point, it also features Greg playing a recording of a younger Steven trying to recreate how they were back then, once again doing exactly what he did in Houseguest, and something that the Gems have already done to Steven this season in Snow Day, which also didn't exactly go well. Despite all of that looming in the background, the montage actually portrays things going fairly well, as Steven seems more and more able to enjoy things as it goes on, ultimately ending with the pair riding into a neighborhood as Steven seems genuinely curious about his father's upbringing, eventually asking him about the origin of their last name, which causes Greg to pull over and begin to break into a house. While it is a little bit weird that this older older Steven can't seem to piece together that this is at the very least a house of somebody that Greg knows, I think his confusion as he tries to figure out what's happening is more representative of the brain fog that he's having at this point of the season, as it becomes kind of clear that he was just engaging in conversations somewhat half-mindedly while he just thought about other stuff, and watching his 50-year-old father jump a fence and climb a tree likely just jumbled him up a little bit. Anyway, with that out of the way, the episode continues its musical symbolism as it plays a remix of Dad Museum, as while that song played in Greg's storage unit, the part of him that he wants to show Steven, Dad Museum 2.0 is all about Steven learning about the parts of his father that he wanted to keep hidden as he explores his childhood home. Anyway, there are two things of note here while Steven tries to figure out whose house he's in, with the first being the comparisons being drawn between the DeMayos and the Diamonds. Besides just being done in fun ways like their spoon collection having white, blue, yellow, and pink stones, both of Steven's parents' caretakers were quite authoritarian, ending up driving Greg and Rose to become essentially the opposite of who they wanted them to be. There is one difference though, which is arguably the most important detail in this episode for understanding the big moment at the end, being that the DeMayos don't want anything to do with Greg, as seen through their unopened letters from him. I think the most damning element is that Greg's address is from Beach City on these letters, insinuating that he's been writing his parents to tell them about Rose and Steven as he finally starts a family, and they don't even give him a chance to be heard. Steven's only real set of grandparents don't even know that he exists. This episode doesn't fully dive into that though, as he begins to gush over the fact that he finally has some semblance of a connection to his human side of the family besides Greg and Andy, but let's be real, the show prefers you don't think about him, as Steven begins to idealize his father's early life, even taking a picture of a younger Greg while saying this pretty depressing line, which makes it even more clear how Steven is trying to identify with his human half.
You look just like me, only more human.
This is why seeing those unopened letters is so important, as without them, the viewer may be under the impression that Greg's parents were still good, but just a tad bit overprotective. But despite Steven seeing evidence this isn't the case, because of his frazzled mental state, he begins to envy Greg's childhood and resent his father for not appreciating it. After Greg grabs what he was looking for, a CD to play for Steven, the pair pull out of the neighborhood, this time with Steven in the driver's seat. And as he drives on the same road that his father did many years ago, Greg plays Steven the song behind their family name and his decision to become a rock star in the form of Mr. Universe by the fictional Carrie Moonbeam. And while you should take into account that I'm a huge David Bowie fan and this is an obvious Bowie-esque song, I genuinely think Mr. Universe has an argument for the most impressively written song in the franchise. The trick to this one is that you're not supposed to think that it's weird that it would affect Greg in such a dramatic way that he would base his entire life on it, while also understanding why it wouldn't be very helpful to Steven. And they do this by appealing so heavily to a kid who's been sheltered their entire life, and being somewhat deflating to a kid who has seen the world and still doesn't know who they are. If you were Greg and felt miserable under the rule of your parents, you could hear these lyrics and dream about everything in the world that you haven't experienced, and how the universe is waiting for you to find your role in it. In that way, it's a really sweet song, and it totally makes sense why this would be such a big deal to Greg. But if you listen to the song from Steven's perspective, you'll hear lyrics all about how seeing the world will allow you to achieve your purpose in the universe, something that Steven feels he's already done, as he's traveled the galaxy and achieved more than any other human in existence, having already saved humanity as a little kid, and yet he still feels so miserable, not knowing who he is without some kind of cosmic threat. Add in the fact that Steven is hearing these lyrics at the same time that he's learning that his family name comes from some 70s song, and it makes sense why this wouldn't exactly help him. The song also manages to fit in little references to Steven's life, as rocks and flowers allude to the gems, and more specifically Rose, and there are quite a few teardrops, temples, and cats in the series, and they also got Jermaine Clement, basically the guy for Bowie parodies like the one in Rick and Morty, to do this song, which results in a pretty authentic sounding 70s glam rock hit, all of which makes this song easily go down as one of my favorites in the franchise. Moving on. After the song, Steven seems more upset than moved about his family name coming from a song, giving his father one more chance to be the parent that he needs and actually talk to him about what's going wrong. But instead, Greg is confused about how this song he holds in such high regard could possibly be ineffective, restarting the tape and setting Steven off. He begins to berate his father for not being more like his parents, and essentially giving Steven over to the gems, who perhaps gave him too much freedom. This scene is done so spectacularly well because there's nobody to root against in this dispute, as while Steven is wrong about Greg's parents being better than his, he's clearly going through something, and Greg is simply unable to be the sturdy figure that his son desperately needs. Everything he says to Steven is so poorly worded, like this statement in response to him saying that he could have had a regular childhood.
Steven, you're a gem! You're not like other kids!
This statement is entirely true. For the sake of humanity, Steven had to focus on stopping the diamonds, but also this is not exactly a great statement to say to your son who's currently having a mental breakdown. This back and forth continues to escalate as Steven hits harder and harder at Greg's failure to parent, ultimately forsaking his family name and crashing the van in the process, a vehicle that has been the setting for many of Steven and Greg's favorite memories together. Despite everything that has happened in this episode though, the most tragic part may be at the very end, when despite all odds, Greg is given another chance to connect to his son and help him as they're stranded waiting for the tow truck. But instead of telling Steven that he needs to do X, Y, and Z and can't stay in this state forever, he simply tells him that he's proud of him for standing up to his father and is glad that he feels comfortable telling his father anything. You can tell by Greg's expression as he thinks of what to say that he is really trying to be a good parent, but partially because his were too authoritarian, he can't help but swing too far the other way, as his solution for Steven isn't therapy or talking about his problems or anything productive, but is literally for him to eat more ice cream until he feels better. At this point, Steven knows that his father isn't going to be able to help, tuning him out as he pulls up the photo of his father's younger self, realizes he no longer feels connected to that part of his life, and deletes the picture, temporarily cutting his father out and setting the stage for Jasper to swoop in the next episode. The breakdown of Greg and Steven's relationship at the end of this episode may initially seem like something that comes suddenly as a result of the mental health issues that Steven is experiencing throughout most of Future, but I think it's important to note that a moment like this was always doomed to happen between the two of them. When looking back at Steven Universe proper, it's hard to find a ton of episodes where Greg ends up teaching Steven something, like parents do, but it's very easy to find multiple episodes like Maximum Capacity or Mr. Greg, where Greg messes something up and ultimately needs the help of his son. This constant reliance on Steven for help is part of the reason he's so messed up in the relatively peaceful Future, but to get back to Greg, while it does feel overly harsh to qualify him as a bad parent, he certainly doesn't do a ton of on-screen parenting, but not all of that is on him, as the gems are certainly the ones with Steven in a parental role for most of the series. Still though, that's why in this moment, when Steven no longer feels close enough to the gems to try and get help, and Greg is the only one there for him, he's simply not prepared to help his son in the way that he needs. Greg simply hasn't been involved as much in Steven's life as most present parents are, and thus can't be the sturdy parental figure that Steven is so desperately looking for throughout this episode, and that's what makes the final 2 or so minutes so tragic. After Steven rejects the song that made Greg into the person that he is, before telling his father that the DeMeo style of parenting, which tortured Greg, would have been better than what he got, Greg is visually saddened by his son's comments, but keeps that to himself after the van crashes. I don't believe that in this moment Greg is actually proud that his son stood up to him, or even truly believes that Steven feels comfortable telling his father anything. In reality, I think Greg is partially just trying to get the conflict to stop, and he's also trying trying to give Steven the validation that his parents never gave him, which is unfortunately the last thing that Steven needs at this point. This episode is easily the most negative view that the franchise ever gives of Greg, but even so, it's so clear throughout this episode that he really does want the best for his son. And out of the three people that Steven looks to for guidance before fully breaking down in the finale, being Greg, Jasper, and the Diamonds, Greg is easily the best. But unfortunately for Mr. Universe, that just wasn't enough to keep his son from deleting that photograph and losing touch with his literal humanity. Anyway, that's about it for me. Besides giving my obligatory Twitter/X/whatever it's called when this video comes out plug, I do want to quickly mention two things that only really matter if you care about AmpleSamuel, so if you just came here for Steven Universe talk, you can bail now. Otherwise, I do want to talk about the fact that about a week before this video comes out, two important things in the Ampleverse occurred. The first of which being the fact that Fiona and Cake got an actual trailer and release date, and the show looks fantastic. While it's obviously unexpected, the direction they're taking with this series is really interesting, and I'm stoked to see how it turns out. As you can probably guess, I am going to cover the show when it releases, but I'm not entirely sure if that's going to be weekly, or if I'm just going to make one obscenely long video when it wraps up. The other thing that happened about a week ago is that I hit 10,000 subscribers, and I just want to say thank you to everybody who has watched or listened to me talk about cartoons over the last 2 or so years. This number is so surreal to me, and I do have somewhat of a 10K special for next month, but until then, just know how genuinely grateful I am. If you want to know if any of the scheduling stuff I just told you about gets changed, you can find my Twitter in the description, but either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in a couple of days for one of my last Adventure Time videos before Fiona and Cake, where I'll cover a different cartoon dad who was mostly good despite a few mistakes. Thanks for watching.